Scott Peterson stood at the center of a perfect-looking life, while Laci Peterson quietly disappeared from it, leaving behind a silence that would grow louder with every passing day. What began as an ordinary morning in a peaceful town slowly transformed into one of the most unsettling true crime cases in modern history. There were no screams, no visible struggle, and no immediate answers. Only a husband whose calm never wavered in a trail of evidence that refused to stay quiet. From the very start, this was not a story about what was said, but about what actions revealed when words were carefully withheld. The story begins in a calm town where nothing seemed out of place. Streets followed their usual rhythm, homes stood neatly decorated, and the season carried a feeling of routine comfort. Scott Peterson moved through this setting without drawing attention. His days appeared structured, predictable, and controlled. To neighbors and acquaintances, he looked like a man with no visible troubles. Yet when his wife vanished, that sense of normal life cracked quietly rather than shattering loudly. There was no dramatic moment that signaled disaster. Instead, confusion crept in slowly, almost politely, as if asking permission to exist. What stood out first was not what Scott did, but what he did not do. There was no visible desperation, no frantic behavior that usually follows sudden loss. Time passed, and his actions stayed measured. He followed his routine closely, making choices that felt oddly disconnected from the seriousness of the situation. While worry spread among family and friends, Scott appeared unchanged. This emotional distance felt unsettling, even if it could not yet be called suspicious. Small details began to carry unusual weight. The way he explained his day sounded smooth, but lacked depth. The timeline he described felt clean, almost too clean, as if it had been organized in advance. Investigators noted how carefully he presented himself, how little emotion escaped his control. In moments where fear or sadness might naturally appear, there was restraint instead. The town slowly shifted from concern to quiet doubt. People started noticing the gaps between Scott's calm exterior and the growing seriousness of the disappearance. Nothing directly pointed to guilt, but nothing pointed clearly to innocence either. The absence of chaos became the first sign that this case would not follow a normal path. From the very beginning, the silence around Scott spoke louder than any cry for help ever could. As the investigation moved forward, attention turned from emotions to facts. Investigators began reconstructing Scott Peterson's movements with careful precision. What first appeared to be a simple timeline slowly developed weak points. Each retelling of his day remained mostly the same, yet subtle differences emerged when compared with phone records, receipts, and witness observations. These changes were small, almost invisible, but together they created tension. The story he presented no longer rested easily against reality. Objects connected to his routine gained unexpected importance. Fishing gear, fuel purchases, and the choice of destination all became pieces of a larger puzzle. None of these items were illegal or unusual on their own, but their timing raised questions. The place Scott claimed to visit that day suddenly aligned too closely with later discoveries. What once felt random began to feel deliberate. Investigators did not rush to conclusions. Instead, they allowed patterns to reveal themselves. Witnesses added another layer of uncertainty. Some recalled seeing Scott earlier than expected, while others described conditions that conflicted with his version of events. The weather, the distance traveled, and the amount of time available did not always match his explanations. These inconsistencies forced investigators to consider that the truth might be hiding behind careful wording. Every minute accounted for on paper felt tighter under scrutiny. As evidence accumulated, the case grew heavier without becoming louder. There was no dramatic turning point, only a steady build of pressure. Investigators understood that lies often survive alone but struggle when surrounded by facts. Scott's story did not collapse, but it began to bend. By the end of this phase, suspicion was no longer based on instinct. It was supported by structure, logic, and a growing sense that the answers were already present, waiting to be connected. As search efforts intensified, The atmosphere surrounding the case grew heavier. Volunteers, officers, and family members focused on finding answers, while public attention increased with each passing day. During this time, Scott Peterson remained visible yet emotionally distant. His presence did not reflect the urgency felt by those around him. Instead of appearing worn down by fear or uncertainty, he maintained a steady composure. This contrast became difficult to ignore as the situation became more serious. Investigators began examining his behavior beyond official statements. Phone records revealed calls made at unusual times, some of them carrying a tone of normalcy that felt out of place. Financial transactions continued without hesitation, suggesting a sense of continuation rather than interruption. These actions alone meant nothing criminal, but in context, they felt misaligned with the reality of a missing spouse. Patterns of behavior often speak louder than isolated events, and these patterns raise concern. Media coverage expanded, placing Scott under constant observation. His public appearances were closely watched, not for what he said, but for what he showed. Body language, timing, and decisions became part of the evidence landscape. While others appeared emotionally exhausted, Scott's restraint stayed intact. This emotional control began to feel less like strength and more like separation. Investigators noted how he avoided situations that required vulnerability. Instead, he focused on maintaining a consistent image. This effort to appear unaffected became its own form of expression. In cases like this, behavior can act as a silent language, revealing intention through absence rather than presence. By the end of this phase, the search was no longer only for a missing person. It had become a study of choices, reactions, and silence. Scott Peterson had not confessed to anything, yet the accumulation of his actions continued to suggest. The discovery near the water marked a turning point that could not be undone. What had once been a case filled with uncertainty suddenly gained physical weight. Investigators focused on the location with intense care, measuring distances, currents, and timelines. This place was not random. It aligned too closely with Scott Peterson's earlier movements, turning coincidence into calculation. The environment itself appeared to confirm what silence had already suggested. Experts examined how natural forces could affect what was found, separating what nature could explain from what it could not. While water and time left their marks, the placement told a clearer story. The connection between Scott's chosen destination and the recovery site became impossible to ignore. This was not a vague link, but a precise overlap that tightened the case dramatically. Each scientific detail added another layer of certainty. The emotional tone of the investigation shifted. Hope gave way to responsibility. The focus moved from searching for someone alive to understanding how events unfolded. Investigators no longer asked if a crime had occurred, but how carefully it had been planned. Every earlier detail, once questioned, now fit into a clearer structure. Actions that once seemed harmless took on darker meaning under this new light. Scott's reaction remained controlled, offering no visible shift that matched the gravity of the moment. This consistency, once seen as calm, now felt detached. The contrast between the severity of the discovery and his steady behavior deepened suspicion rather than easing it. There was no visible collapse, no sudden change, only the same restraint. From this point forward, the case no longer relied on interpretation alone. Physical evidence had entered the narrative, anchoring suspicion to reality. The water had revealed what words never would. What emerged was not just proof of loss, but proof of connection. As pressure closed in, Scott Peterson's behavior began to change in ways that felt more revealing than defensive. Investigators noticed that his focus shifted from cooperating to preparing. His movements became deliberate, and his choices suggested adjustment rather than shock. While the case against him strengthened, he appeared to be organizing his life around an outcome he seemed to anticipate. This quiet preparation stood in sharp contrast to the seriousness of the situation. Items discovered during this period raised serious concern. Possessions that hinted at travel and survival suggested an intention to distance himself from what was coming. These were not impulsive decisions made in fear, but calculated steps taken with foresight. Each object added weight to the belief that Scott was not reacting to events, but planning beyond them. Investigators saw this as a reflection of mindset rather than coincidence. His appearance also shifted. Changes that might seem minor under normal circumstances took on significance within the context of the investigation. The effort to alter how he was seen suggested a desire to disappear into anonymity. This was not the behavior of someone expecting resolution, but of someone anticipating capture. The contrast between his controlled calm and these subtle preparations deepened suspicion. Authorities interpreted these actions as silent admissions. People facing false accusations often cling to familiarity, hoping truth will restore order. Scott, however, appeared to be moving away from stability. This direction told its own story. Every step taken during this phase reinforced the idea that he understood the weight of the evidence against him. By the end of this chapter, the case had moved beyond doubt. Scott had not spoken a confession, yet his actions reflected acceptance rather than resistance. The evidence continued to assemble itself, proving that sometimes guilt reveals itself, not through words. The courtroom became the place where every silent detail finally stood together. There were no dramatic confessions or emotional displays to rely on. Instead, the case unfolded through structure and sequence. Prosecutors focused on actions, timelines, and physical proof, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Each piece was presented carefully, showing how individual facts connected into one clear path. The story was not rushed. It was built slowly, layer by layer, until it felt complete. Jurors listened as Scott Peterson's movements were traced with precision. Locations, times, and choices were aligned against the evidence collected during the investigation. Nothing stood alone. Each fact supported another, forming a chain that could not easily be broken. What made the case powerful was its consistency. There were no wild theories, only documented actions and verified findings. The absence of emotional explanation from Scott made the evidence feel even heavier. The defense attempted to introduce uncertainty, pointing to the lack of direct eyewitnesses and spoken admissions. However, the structure of the case left little space for doubt. The prosecution did not need Scott to explain himself. His behavior before and after the disappearance already told a complete story. The jury was asked to consider not what was said, but what was done. Throughout the proceedings, Scott maintained the same controlled appearance he had shown from the beginning. This restraint, once seen as composure, now felt disconnected from reality. The gravity of the situation contrasted sharply with his steady presence. For the jury, this lack of visible response did not suggest innocence. Instead, it reinforced the idea of emotional distance. By the end of the trial phase, the courtroom had become a mirror reflecting the truth. Without spoken confession, the evidence had formed one on its own. Silence, structure, and consistency had carried the case forward, leaving the final judgment. As the trial progressed toward its conclusion, public attention intensified. Media coverage analyzed every detail, yet the core of the case remained unchanged. Outside opinions shifted back and forth, but inside the courtroom, the evidence stood firm. Investigators and prosecutors did not rely on speculation or emotion. They relied on patterns that could not be explained away. Scott Peterson's life during the critical period had been mapped carefully, leaving little room for alternative interpretations. The jury weighed not only what was presented, but what was missing. There were no desperate attempts to search, no frantic efforts to correct the narrative, and no actions that reflected genuine confusion. Instead, there was consistency. His behavior followed a steady line from the beginning of the disappearance to the final days of the trial. This consistency, rather than protecting him, became one of the strongest indicators of guilt. Public debate often focused on the absence of a spoken confession. Some questioned how someone could be convicted without direct admission. Yet the case demonstrated how actions can replace words. Every choice Scott made added another silent statement to the record. The location he visited, the timing of his movements, and his preparations after the fact all pointed in the same direction. No single piece demanded conviction, but together they formed a conclusion that felt unavoidable. As deliberations approached, the emotional weight of the case became clear. This was no longer about speculation or theory. It was about accountability. The jury did not need to imagine what happened. They needed only to follow the evidence where it led. Scott's continued silence did not weaken the case. It strengthened it. By this stage, the truth had settled into place. The evidence no longer asked questions. It delivered answers. Scott Peterson's silence had become complete, not as a defense, but as confirmation built from everything he had done. In the end, the case closed without the moment many expected. There was no dramatic breakdown, no spoken confession to seal the truth. Instead, the conclusion arrived quietly, carried by evidence that had been building from the very beginning. Scott Peterson's story was complete, not because he told it, but because his actions had already done so. Every choice, every movement, and every moment of restraint had shaped the outcome long before the final decision was reached. The verdict marked the end of the investigation, but it also marked the beginning of understanding how silence can reveal guilt. This case showed that truth does not always emerge through emotion or explanation. Sometimes it forms through patterns that refuse to break. Scott's calm behavior, once overlooked, became central to the narrative. His consistency, his distance, and his preparation all pointed toward a conclusion that no argument could erase. What remained after the trial was a lasting impact. The case became a reference point in true crime history, studied not for shocking revelations, but for how evidence can speak when a suspect will not. It reminded investigators and the public alike that behavior leaves traces just as clearly as physical proof. Silence, when paired with action, can be louder than any confession. For those who followed the case, the ending felt heavy but inevitable. The truth had been visible long before it was officially acknowledged. It existed in the gaps between words, in the absence of urgency, and in the choices made under pressure. Justice did not arrive through admission, but through persistence and careful observation. This story stands as a reminder that not all confessions are spoken. Some are written slowly, through time, evidence, and consequence. Scott Peterson never needed to say the truth aloud. By the end, the evidence had already said everything for him.